everyone. We will go ahead and get started. A few people trickling in, but welcome to Catapult's webinar series, Closing the Gap, Elevating Women in Sports, where we're featuring industry-leading experts across the globe who are actively working to champion women in sports. My name is Ruth Higgins, and I am a 2021 Women in Sports Tech Fellow. Women in Sports Tech is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to drive transformative growth opportunities for women at all stages of their careers through the sports tech and innovation landscape, while also introducing middle and high school young women to the wide array of career paths in the industry. So as a fellow this summer, I'm working with one of Women in Sports Tech's partners, which is Catapult, and I'm interning there this summer. And so today we have Jamie Coffey, who is currently in his third year as the Scotland Women Lead National Team Physiotherapist. Jamie is going to be discussing concussion risk management and international female rugby union players. There will be time to ask questions at the end of Jamie's presentation, so please use the Q&A feature, which can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we will spend the last 15 to 20 minutes giving Jamie time to answer those questions. So without further ado, Jamie, I will let you take it from here.
Cheers. Thanks, Ruth. Thank you for the intro. Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying thanks to Catapult and to Hannah and Gordon at Catapult for the invite to present to you here today. I'm really excited to present to you this evening or afternoon, morning, depending where you're based. And I really hope that I'm able to present some interesting and topical information surrounding the incidence, management and mitigation of concussion within elite international women's rugby union. I'm a physio by trade. I've worked in professional rugby union across both men's and women's platforms and 15s and 7s codes for close to a decade now. And I've been really fortunate to work with the women's senior national programs in my current role as the national lead physiotherapist for the last 3 seasons. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank in advance my colleagues within the women's department at Scottish Rugby. Their performance, experience and expertise is invaluable, and the following presentation is a representation of the collaborative work of our performance department as a whole. So what is rugby union? Rugby union is a complex contact sport which demands the athlete to be able to sprint repeatedly, cover large distances during a game with intermittent explosive contact-based actions, such as accelerating through a tackle, clearing an opponent out in a ruck, or a maximal isometric activity such as a scrum. All the while having to focus on the technical and tactical elements demanded of a high-speed team sport. Contact demands in the male game are really well documented. Tierney et al. Have previously observed that peak demands in a professional male club game can be as high as 0.85 collisions per minute. And unpublished data from our most recent 2021 Women's Six Nations demonstrates a peak collision effort of 0.71 per minute. It's really not easy to draw comparisons between men's and women's games or versions of the sport due to the physical differences in the athletes, such as size and speed, as well as the tactical variations in terms of ball and play time or kick versus run decision making. There are also massive differences in terms of 7s and 15s codes participation. And in women's rugby, it's really not uncommon for players to play across both codes, whereas in men's rugby, that would be considered to be quite rare. And this can often make physical preparation difficult for these crossover athletes. In rugby union, a tackle or collision is made using the shoulder of the defending player to tackle the opposition player from the shoulder level or below. And as we'll discuss later, the nature of the collision demand within this sport can often lead to high rates of injury in comparison to other contact team sports. A 2018 audit performed by World Rugby identified 2.7 million registered female players worldwide, showing an annual increase in registered athletes of 10% and accounting for more than a quarter of total global participation. Female rugby union is the fastest growing team sport worldwide, experiencing exponential growth in participation numbers and global interest. And World Rugby and its member unions recognise that this offers significant potential growth in revenue streams. And individual unions also recognise this growth as a business opportunity due to the men's game reaching a perceived ceiling in terms of income it can generate. So they're investing heavily in the structural development of the women and girls games. With this increased participation, obviously comes an increased risk of injury and injury incidence. And World Rugby has created one of the most comprehensive and transparent approaches to injury epidemiology of all sports governing bodies. Player welfare is considered at the forefront of all decision-making processes. during the evolution and development of the game, and World Rugby promotes a player-first attitude while relying on evidence-based approach to drive decision-making within the game. To illustrate the varying demands per position, this slide displays the peak demand for some specific variables gathered via GPS for an international test match. As you can see, there are significant differences in the physical demands for each position. Awareness of the peak exposure of these metrics is integral when preparing athletes adequately to cope with match day demands. Each position within the rugby field has a unique set of demands, which is why the game has been championed as a game for all. For example, a prop forward may be required to transition for a max isometric effort within a scrum, accelerate across the field to get into position to carry a ball into contact, and then quickly regain position to clear out a ruck at the next breakdown. This is compared to a winger or a back three player who may be required to cover huge distances over the course of the 80-minute game. They may be required to cover the backfield, sprint large distances to create a kick chase, or cover in defence in the event of a line break by the opposition. Contact demands also vary hugely. Back row and centres often have the highest tackle count in a match, whereas second row and props are required to clear out a high number of rucks or breakdowns or carry the ball into heavy contact. So although we can quantify collision number, it's very difficult to quantify the physical demands as the nature of each contact collision differs significantly. And these factors have to be taken into consideration when designing training and conditioning sessions. Careful session design and the ability to monitor contact exposure in the training week ensures that athletes are adequately prepared for the rigors of the test match arena. Our injury audit data demonstrates that the largest proportion of time loss injuries are incurred in the final quarter of matches, outlining the likely impact of fatigue on injury incidents and highlighting the importance of ensuring that training replicates worst case scenario a player may be exposed to in a game setting. Alongside injury incidence data, player body mass and height data has been collected. In a predominantly amateur population, you can see there's been minimal change in anthropometrics across World Cup cycles in the top graph that's there. There's been a small but statistically significant increase in the height of backs, but not forwards, over the period from 2006 to 2017. There was no statistically significant change observed in body mass of backs or forwards for the same period. As the women's game continues to evolve and more unions embrace professionalism, it may be anticipated that a similar trend to that which was observed in the men's game of increasing physical characteristics will occur. Men's rugby union became a professional sport in 1995. And from the below graph, you can see that over this period, there's been a significant increase in player mass observed in the teams participating in the men's Six Nations tournament. Could we expect to see a similar development in women's rugby as the teams become more professional? Very possibly. Future research to evaluate the potential impact of increasing player mass, strength, and fitness on collision demand will be important for informing future practice and preparation. Although predominantly still amateur, there is an ever-increasing number of professional female athletes, and those who do remain amateur are now better physically prepared than they have ever been previously. So what is a concussion? The Berlin Consensus Statement in 2016 states that a sports-related concussion is defined as a traumatic brain injury induced by biomechanical forces that have several common features may be used to clinically define the nature of said concussive injury. A concussion may result from a direct blow to the head or body, which results in impulsive force being transmitted to the head. It may cause the rapid onset of short-lived neurological dysfunction. However, in some cases, this may not present for a period of time post-insult. It may present with a range of clinical signs and symptoms, which may or may not involve the loss of consciousness. And importantly, these clinical signs and symptoms cannot be explained by drug use, alcohol consumption, medication, or any other injury. Concussion is the most common specific injury sustained by both backs, with 22.2% of all injuries and 15.1% of injuries for forwards across 4 Women's World Cup tournaments from 2006 to 2017. Across these most recent 4 World Cup cycles, there's been an increase across all injuries, with concussion incidence rising each competition. Comparison across World Cup cycles is exceptionally difficult, however, given the significant change in multiple variables over the last 15 years. Concussion diagnosis, management, awareness of both players and practitioners has progressed dramatically over this period, and many of the factors which may contribute to this will be discussed within this presentation. According to an 8-season study of injuries sustained in the Women's Sevens World Series tournament, conducted by Fuller and Taylor and published this year, concussion is the most common injury sustained by both backs and forwards. It's also been noted that the trend and proportion of concussion injury shows a small, yet non-significant increasing trend over this period. This is likely to reflect the evolving match and collision demands observed over this period. Unfortunately, this is not widely published in female populations. However, this has been observed in our own data collection. Increased collision demand, high-speed running exposure, work rate, and acceleration efforts have been observed per season within our squad, which is likely to reflect the overall increase in skill set, physical preparation, tactical awareness, and the evolving level of competition which is now present within the women's international game. As with any injury reduction strategy or intervention, it was critical for us as a support team to understand the probabilistic injuries within our population of athletes. In the absence of any significant, robustly gathered data set, the first step for us as a programme was to gain clarity on the specific injury issues prevalent within our squad. Our initial data collection took place in 2018-19 season, after which it was evident that concussion presented not only the highest incidence of time loss injury, but also the highest number of time loss days in total across our senior performance squad, which is a collection of 32 athletes who have been identified as those most likely to represent our senior 15s or 7s programme squads within that season. Reviewing this data at the end of the season allowed the performance support staff the opportunity to explore risk factors for this athletic population, implement targeted injury prevention strategies to mitigate this risk, and provide a tool for continued monitoring of the effectiveness of this intervention strategy. Following our maiden collection, the increase of concussion within our playing squad has reduced, along with total time lost due to concussion and the average number of days lost per incidence. This data is definitely promising and is likely due in some respect to the intervention strategies which we've put in place, but consideration must also be made to external factors such as reduced match play exposure since March 2012 due to the impact on COVID-19 on sub-elite rugby union in Scotland. The majority of concussions, as we know from our auditing, are experienced in matches, and due to COVID, all club rugby in Scotland has been cancelled, with the exception of international test matches, which have been only match exposure for the majority of athletes in Scotland over the past year. Concussion has become prevalent across global media platforms. In recent seasons, with the most high-profile lawsuits occurring in American football, with NFL so far paying out over $1 billion in compensation to former players. Rugby union has also faced similar issues in recent years, with several high-profile international male players recently seeking legal action against World Rugby and their respective playing unions. This negative media coverage may have huge implications for rugby union as a whole, from grassroots participation right through to commercial revenue streams and even the sport's existence. World Rugby has identified player welfare as a central pillar to their approach to growing the sport of rugby union, and to ensure future growth is achieved at a similar rate as they're experiencing presently, they've acknowledged that wide sweeping change is required to ensure that the sport is safe for those participating and enjoyable for those watching. We'll discuss later in the presentation some of the research and regulation review which is taking place. Risk factors can be divided into modifiable and non-modifiable components. An understanding of those which may not be modifiable is definitely important to underpin strategies which target those which can be modified. It's been reported that female athletes are more susceptible to sports-related concussions and experience worse outcomes when compared to male athletes. It's also been reported that female athletes experience longer return to place timescales than males participating in the same contact sport. Although numerous studies on sports-related concussion have compared the outcomes of concussion in male and female athletes post-injury, research pertaining to why female athletes have worse outcomes is limited. A systematic review conducted by McGroarty and published in 2020 concluded that possible factors that put female athletes at a higher risk for concussion include biomechanical and hormonal differences. However, no evidence was presented which supported claims that menstrual cycle or the use of oral contraceptive increased concussion risk. However, they may have an impact on recovery post-concussion. The review findings suggested that female athletes have a lower biomechanical threshold for concussion, a risk factor which in turn may be modifiable with appropriate targeted approach to physical preparation. Rugby union is predominantly an amateur sport, which, as previously alluded to, is experiencing significant growth in female participation. Increased centralised and club funding and investment in female sport has seen the introduction of performance pathway programmes in recent years. This has provided increased opportunity for female athletes to participate in rugby union and performance environments from a far younger age. Unfortunately, this early exposure to the complex technical and tactical demands of rugby union is far from norm. In Scotland, until very recently, a large proportion of players would take up the sport much later than male counterparts. Players are often first exposed to rugby in their late teenage years and frequently at university. There are very few club teams in Scotland who operate a female age grade programme. So this late introduction to the sport clearly poses issues. Players who are not exposed to the technical demands of a collision sport demonstrate poor technical ability, which then means when they're exposed to playing with players who are significantly more experienced, increases their injury risk significantly. Players with limited rugby experience may have significant experience of a different sport or may have been identified through talent ID or talent transfer pathways. So despite being physically well conditioned for the demands of the sport, a high risk remains due to the lack of technical ability or knowledge regarding body management in contact. Match awareness, positional understanding, and skill acquisition has evolved over time, with exposure to sufficient skill-specific training and matches. The ability to implement technical skills in an unpredictable, chaotic environment of a live rugby match is a skill which has developed over many years. Therefore, with limited task-specific exposure, overall injury risk is considered to remain high. Due to the game's growth, funding, and increased sophistication of talent transfer and performance pathways, the number of players who progress to international level who have limited game exposure should be mitigated to some extent in the future. It's also widely documented that one of the most significant risk factors for concussion incidents is a previous history of concussion. A study by Hollis in 2009 reported that amateur rugby union players who sustained a concussion were 1.7 times more likely to suffer a subsequent concussion in the following 12 months, and 1.6 times more likely to sustain a further concussion. Those with 2 concussions were 1.6 times more likely to sustain a further concussion in the same season. A recent concussion history is considered to have a significant impact on sensory motor feedback systems, which may then in turn place athletes at a higher risk of other musculoskeletal injury, such as lower extremity injury for up to 24 months post-concussion. Neuromotor alterations incurred post a concussive episode have been shown to affect the ability to control the head in tackle or collision situations, which also increase the risk of further concussion. This was confirmed in a 2019 study by Busse et al., who established that a history of concussion is associated with higher head acceleration and reduced cervical muscle activity during a simulated rugby tackle. These long-term deficits, which remain present long after the athletes recover from what we'd consider to be normal concussive symptoms or presentation, provide additional challenges when rehabilitating athletes post-concussion. Therefore, it's important that the player and the coaching staff and everyone else involved in the performance environment are aware of the potential increase in risk for injury for the future and rehabilitation strategies. With regards to hormones, there is conflicting evidence within the literature as to the impact of the hormonal differences between sex with regards to the increased risk of sports-related concussion and the impact of recovery length post-concussion. Pilot study by Lafontaine and colleagues in 2019 investigated the potential for a relationship between increased incidence and the stage of menstrual cycle in female athletes, with findings suggestive of increased risk during the late luteal phase and early menstrual phase. However, this study was performed in an extremely small sample group, and much further research is required in this area to determine if this is of significance. Gallagher in 2018 examined the effects of gender and hormonal contraception use on outcomes following concussion in collegiate varsity athletes. They identified that male athletes on average had a shorter length of recovery than female athletes, yet had comparable symptom severity scores at onset. They also reported that this initial symptom severity score was strongly related to length of recovery for males, but not for females. Within the female cohort, non-hormonal contraceptive users demonstrated higher severity scores than those who didn't use using hormonal contraceptive. However, no significant difference in length of return between these two groups was established. It's currently debated whether estrogen, the primary female sex hormone, has a detrimental or neuroprotective effect with regard to concussion. Animal models have shown that estrogen treatment before experimentally induced brain injury has protective effect for male rats, but detrimental effects in female rats. And one reason this is considered might be that estrogen acts as a neuroprotector because of the hormone's lipid antioxidant properties. Again, however, research in this area is exceptionally limited, and there's very little published on the role of estrogen in the risk of concussion. So it's very much an area where further research is required. As identified in the Berlin Consensus Statement, scientific evidence to support the success of concussion injury prevention strategies is limited due to conflicting evidence, poor study design, and bias. With the knowledge yielded from our injury audit and an understanding of the risk factors presented, a three-pronged approach was to tackling the highest of concussion within our performance squad was designed and implemented using the expertise of all of our staff within the programme. The strategy adopted targeted three primary modifiable risk factors: cervical isometric strength, technical contact proficiency and training exposure, and player education. Tierney and colleagues found that sex differences exist in head-neck segment dynamic stabilization during head angular acceleration, or movements which are similar to the concussive acceleration-deceleration forces. Females exhibited significantly greater head-neck segment peak acceleration and displacement than males. The authors concluded, therefore, that female heads are susceptible to higher speeds of acceleration and greater displacement following an application of an external force. The authors also noted that college-age female athletes were found to have approximately 43% less head-neck segment mass compared to college-age male athletes. This correlated with a 49% reduction in peak extensor strength and 30% less neck girth in the female cohort. These findings have been supported by other studies, with Garces in 2002 reporting that male college students had 30 to 40% more strength in neck extensors and flexors than female college students. In the absence of published neck strength data in female international rugby union players, normative baselines published by Hamilton and Gatherer in 2014 for male professional rugby union players were adapted and used as our initial target relative to body weight. Isometric strength targets used for our cohorts were 25% body weight for neck flexion, 40% body weight for lateral flexion, and 45% body weight for extension. Anecdotally, we found these targets to be appropriate and achievable for our playing group. As would be expected, athletes with limited training history in the weights room and limited rugby experience have been observed to deviate further from the baselines on assessment. One of the weaknesses which has been highlighted in the field of neck strength research is the lack of data regarding measurement reliability, and often assessments undertaken in a standardized seated position, which is completely unrelated to positions in which concussions are occurred when participating in contact sports. Really interestingly, a recent study just recently published by Salmon and colleagues this year has demonstrated reliability when assessing isometric neck strength in a simulated contact posture, as well as providing minimally detectable change scores for these assessments. And these are really useful tools when we're understanding the effectiveness of intervention strategies and assessing how we are going forward. Players within our programme are assessed at 3 phases throughout the competitive season, in line with our battery of physical screening. We test at pre-season to inform our KPIs and individual focus for the key window of physical preparation. At the end of pre-season to assess effectiveness of intervention and inform our maintenance strategies. And then we test again post our festive break to inform any changes in programming required prior to beginning the Six Nations, which is our annual key competition period occurring between February and April. As a programme, our approach to neck strengthening is collaborative across the whole sports science and medicine team, with everyone included in the designing process and everyone accountable for assessment, intervention and monitoring, with 3 key principles adopted. Consistent programming stimulus is our primary pillar. When working with amateur athletes, we really have to be quite efficient with the time that we have with the athletes in the weights room. Fundamental to this is establishing non-negotiables within our programming. Neck strength is one of these, both from an injury prevention strategy and a performance enhancement strategy. Our approach is very much rugby first. If an athlete's unable to take the field for a skills or a rugby session, then we've inhibited their ability to improve at that sport. So all programming is designed with that in mind. Neck strength is included in every athlete's programme, whether for maintenance and those who've achieved our baseline standards, or more frequently for those who require development in that area. The second fundamental is regular monitoring and formal assessment of the KPIs, which we've established with each athlete. This is undertaken primarily at the 3 key screening stages implemented across each season. Athletes are formally assessed for neck strength at each of these windows. However, rudimental technology such as the use of crane scales, as you can see in the image attached, the orange unit there, enable the athlete to receive instant feedback on their performance within and between sessions. We then get the athlete to record this data within their weights log, which allows performance team to assess how they're progressing and to track and change any modifications to the program as required. Our third fundamental is feedback. A pillar to our performance ethos is clarity and transparency, which in turn creates accountability for staff from a programming perspective and also athletes from a training perspective. This is achieved informally through the use of objective feedback, as we've mentioned previously, but also formally. Individual athlete planning meetings are aligned to key stages within the season, and these provide a really good opportunity for the athlete to be presented with feedback on their athletic and technical development, as well as providing a forum of discussion of KPIs related to these outcomes. The role of the physiotherapist in this environment is not simply injury management and screening. We have a significant role to play in offering insight into a collaborative approach to injury risk reduction through combining shared experience with sports science, analysis, and coaching colleagues. It's everyone's responsibility within the team to influence where they can. As you can see from the audit data on the left-hand side of the slide, contact moments account for a considerable number of time loss mechanisms within our female international squad. And as alluded to earlier, game experience and technical ability within this cohort of athlete varies significantly. Even in recent months, we've had players transitioning from club rugby to train with our national performance squads at 18, 19, 20 years old, who are experiencing their first true technical contact rugby session. And that's occurring in a senior national team environment. These players would regularly participate in full contact training, full contact matches with their clubs with limited technical input. Therefore, it's no surprise that risk of concussion and other contact-related injuries is high. The video on the right-hand side there demonstrates, if I just try and hit play on that again. An example of a technically ineffective tackle where the blue number 18 finds herself in an upright position, making a head-on-head contact with her opponent in what would be considered to be a mechanism highly suspicious of concussion. A significant recommendation which has been actioned over the past 2 seasons has been to introduce technical, and that's not necessarily full live contact, into every rugby session ran at international and pathway level. And we're trying to cascade that information down to the club environment as well. A technical framework has been constructed by our coaching staff to ensure technical proficiency in the task is obtained prior to introducing unpredictability or fatigue to these tasks. This has involved the early introduction of basic controlled contact tackle and breakdown skills with no external variability. These are progressed in a stepwise manner to semi-controlled small-sided games where players are rewarded for implementing correct technique or correct technical elements that have been initially programmed in the technical drills. Contacts then progress to live small-sided games before introducing games under fatigue to replicate the demands of a fixture. This method or approach has undoubtedly proven to be one of the most significant changes in our approach to combating this issue. And the framework behind this model is somewhat similar to the control chaos theory, which was proposed by Taberner in 2019, which I'm sure quite a few of you will be familiar with. Central to this is the adoption of a cohesive approach to injury reduction with the coaching staff. Without their input and technical knowledge, understanding of technical models, and the ability to adapt the varying degrees of skill set within a playing group, this process just wouldn't be successful. And we have to have a shared understanding that this all contributes towards creating a winning team or a winning environment. World Rugby has previously stated that head contact is endemic within rugby union and that the only way to reduce concussion is to reduce the number of head contacts in games. They've proposed several initiatives to change player behaviour in contact, and they've stated that we must act based on science and not emotion, but that actions must not interfere with the fabric of the game and that player safety is number one in the hierarchy of need. The trend within rugby union for increased ball and play time, which therefore increases number of collisions and contacts that players are exposed to during a match. Injury risk naturally increases with increased exposure to contact. Therefore, how does the game evolve to mitigate this risk? Player behaviour, contact technique, and law change all play an integral part in reducing risk. Player welfare sits at the top of any decision-making tree. To this end, World Rugby conducted an in-depth review of contact and collision with specific regard to concussion incidents. A study by Tucker et al. And published in the BJSM in 2017 reported that head contact between a tackler's head and a ball carrier's head or shoulder was significantly more likely to lead to an HIA, which is a head injury assessment, than contact below the level of the shoulder. Player body position was noted to be a significant risk factor, with an injury risk 1.5 times greater when both the tackler and ball carrier are in an upright position. Based on the outcomes of this study, several law changes were proposed to World Rugby. This necessitated the introduction of the high tackle decision-making framework. Increased on-field and post-match sanction for tackles or collisions where direct impact is made to the head or neck region of an opponent was implemented, with the aim of changing behaviour of players in the contact setting and reducing concussion risk. The strict application of laws regarding contact with opponents' heads have led to a significant increase in the number of on-field sanctions since its inception in 2016. However, this has resulted in a reduction in concussion when applied appropriately, with a trial study involving 217 games observing a 34% reduction in concussive episodes compared to a control group where tackle height laws remained unchanged. The final pillar in our approach is player education. A World Rugby statement in 2016 stipulated that concussion education, prevention, management and research sits at the heart of World Rugby's player welfare strategies aimed at protecting players at all levels of the sport. Team coaches, athletes and medics are required to undergo mandatory annual education updates which are designed to ensure that players who suffer concussion are managed effectively to protect their long-term health and welfare. By educating athletes on the risks, signs and symptoms of concussions and providing an open and safe environment to disclose concerns, we can limit the potential to miss concussion in the future. Education also provides a platform to ensure there's absolute clarity on the appropriate management and return to play pathways for both players and coaching staff. The Welsh Rugby Union commissioned research in 2017 to understand perceptions and knowledge regarding concussion within staff and player populations in both professional and amateur environments. Several role-specific misconceptions and deficiencies in concussion knowledge were identified, and they also stated that this should be targeted through education. It was established that coaches and referees had really good knowledge of the signs and symptoms of concussion, but that return to play guidelines and concussion prevention strategies were poorly understood, particularly in amateur clubs. Similar research undertaken in other sports has presented similar findings and has led to the widespread campaigning to increase awareness, not only in rugby union, but in all sports, of the signs and symptoms consistent with a concussion and the requirement for appropriate management should a concussion be suspected. The recognise and remove term and action is central to safeguarding athletes in the amateur game, removing the decision-making ability from the athlete. As with any diagnosis, there is room for human error, and there are a number of technological advances which are currently being trialled with the aim of further informing and enhancing practice. Multiple sporting bodies across the globe and a spectrum of contact sports now recognise the potential impact of concussion on participation, and even the future viability of some sports. Mainstream and social media scrutiny, historical lawsuits, and the threat of future litigation has forced governing bodies to reassess every aspect of their sport. We've spoken previously around World Rugby's law review to improve player welfare, and sports are now also investing heavily in technology to improve diagnostic accuracy and inform recovery and management of athletes. Rugby Union, NFL and AFL are three sports who are at the forefront in the development and application of these technologies in real-world scenarios. Mouthguards are an essential piece of kit worn by all players in Rugby Union. GPS units worn on the back of an athlete can accurately quantify the number of collisions an athlete has made and the acceleration-deceleration forces of these collisions. However, this data cannot be used to accurately present information on the linear or rotational motions, location of impact, or direction of collision during a contact mechanism. The mouthguard presents an ideal opportunity to gather this data. There are many companies undertaking studies in this area where the mouthguard is identical to a regular guard, with the exception of accelerometers, gyroscopes, and various other wireless equipment embedded. And currently, World Rugby, in conjunction with the University of Otago in New Zealand, are undertaking a large study to assess the reliability of mouthguards when monitoring the nature and frequency of head impacts in men's, women's, and junior categories. And mouthguards are not the only piece of equipment which has been used in the past to monitor collisions in rugby. As far back as 2015, Saracens Rugby Club in the English Premiership made media headlines when players appeared in a fixture with sensors taped behind the ear, as you can see in the picture in the top right there. These were used in early studies to assess impact forces sustained by an athlete in collision, and similar devices have since been used by teams in the NHL and NFL. It's hoped that data collected and the research conducted using both the mouthguard and sensor patches will form part of the evolution of evidence-based concussion diagnosis in sport. In the future, we may be able to apply this evidence-based to observe real-time feedback and enhance the ability to monitor impacts and collisions to the head of an athlete. This will in turn aid the identification of potential concussive events and enable swift decision-making regarding the suitability of that athlete to continue to play. This is a constantly evolving field of research, and it could be that in the future we're able to quantify an individual's baseline or threshold to concussion. A large prospective observational study of non-invasive concussion biomarkers named SCRUMS, or the study of concussion in rugby union through microRNAs, was conducted by the University of Birmingham in the UK. Over 3 seasons, they monitored male professional rugby union and managed to successfully identify unique signatures of concussion in the saliva of players diagnosed with concussion. The authors recognise that future research is required in female rugby populations to understand if this test is equally as accurate within female players, but it's an exciting evolution in concussion diagnosis. In the future, this non-invasive objective tool could prove to be a real game changer for all sports, from grassroots right through to the elite level, potentially providing instant biometric information which could be used to help clinicians to make accurate diagnosis. World Rugby has also entered into a trial of eye tracking technology for the 2021-22 season, where oculomotor tests are used within the HIA process, where a player is removed from play for a period of time for further concussion assessment to assess impairment in smooth pursuit or saccadic function. Currently, this is assessed by the team clinician with a player observed following the medic's finger. This eye tracking technology provides a baseline individual to each athlete's eye function, which can be used for comparison in the event of a potential concussion. It can be undertaken rapidly and can be used in any environment while providing additional diagnostic accuracy. It may also be used to inform recovery post-concussion and readiness to commence return to play. So finally, in summary, some key take-home messages for me when I was creating this presentation. Concussion is currently the #1 injury challenge in rugby union, that's without doubt, not only in terms of time loss incidents, but also as a threat for the future growth of the game. Injury prevention focus is individual to each specific squad and sport. There is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to reduction strategies. Therefore, audit, implementation, and regular review are essential. For me, prevention is performance. Reducing injury risk facilitates an athlete to be able to spend more time training in their chosen sport, more time improving their skills, more time in the field of play, more time developing a match understanding, which in turn therefore increases the likelihood of their team winning. So I think that underpins everything when we talk about injury prevention and how we gain buy-in from athletes and from coaches and from other practitioners is an understanding that this is performance, this will improve performance. Prevention is everybody's responsibility within the multidisciplinary team and requires buy-in from all professions to make it successful. And finally, we need more research in female athletic populations. And for this, we need to improve collaboration, both within our own sport and across different sports. And this can only help us to improve the service that we provide to our athletes. The final 3 slides I've put up, which will stay on the video, is just a reference list should any of you wish to look at any of the sources which I've used throughout this presentation. And finally, I'd like to thank you all once again for your time this evening, and thanks to Catapult for hosting. I'm more than happy to host any questions should you have any. I'm also attempting to be somewhat a bit more active on social media, so I can be contacted on the media handles below if you prefer reaching out using those avenues.
Hey, Jamie. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We don't have any yet, but I do have a question for you. So I know and I've heard that concussions, that you're more susceptible to future concussions when you've had one. But you mentioned that there, and I just kind of thought that was like the trauma. But you mentioned that there's actually like a cervical musculature difference in people who've had concussions before. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So the current thought is that you get a reduction in your rate of force development or reaction time. So not only do you get your sensory motor reduction where perception of gameplay, slowing down in speed of thought or ability to react to stimulus, i.e. a player coming towards you and adopt a suitable position is thought to be impaired. But there's also thought to be a reduction in your ability to generate force or to isometrically control the head position when you go into contact, or that slight reduction in force development, which then obviously causes the head neck segment to move quicker or a higher velocity and higher shift in movement, which then, I suppose, increases the sloshing effect of the brain and therefore giving you a higher risk of concussion mechanism. But also that threshold is thought to be slightly lowered. And I guess that's probably one thing that I came across when I was doing a bit of background reading is there's a huge amount of research which is going on at the moment, has been going on, and it's constantly evolving. So there's more research being done, which then kind of precludes things which have come out previously. We have a greater understanding of some of the mechanisms, but there's still so much which isn't understood fully, which is why it's such an interesting topic.
Yeah, I had never heard that before. That's very interesting. Do you tailor therapy differently to people who have had a concussion then, like based on, I guess, strengthening those muscles?
It's something which we should probably pay a bit more credence to, and we have an awareness obviously of the players who have a higher concussion history and they are predisposed, given the theory, to having more concussion in the future. So those are the players who we have the absolute non-negotiable. They're the criticals. They don't really ever go into maintenance phase. They're constantly developing. We don't have any absolute thresholds for neck strength or baselines in female rugby union players. Like I said, we've adapted men's scores, and when I say adapted, we've scaled them down slightly based off some of the data that we're seeing. I think the difficulty within women's rugby or rugby just generally is it's a game where there are, similar to NFL, so many different body types. We have players ranging in the women's game from 50 kilos to 100 kilos, from 5'3" to 6'2". Like the anthropometrics vary so massively. So we've tried to scale it to body weight, but then obviously when you scale any objective measure to body weight, heavier athletes are going to find it more difficult to achieve that. And the heavier athletes tend to be those who need a bit more neck strength from a technical performance perspective in a scrum, where they have to use the front row, particularly, they have to use the head to extend and drive into an opponent to try and push an opponent basically out of their stable position and power through. So we do tend to definitely target those that have had a previous concussion history with more neck strength. We do tailor it slightly in that we might look at using rapid isometrics or exercises which demand a rapid force development. We might also use things like Swiss balls where we have to react dynamically, or banded perturbations as an addition, but they tend to be more added to the kind of our basic pillar is you can't go wrong with getting strong. So get the athletes strong, and that seems to have served us quite well at the moment.
Well, again, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Jamie, can you tell us a little about your career before Scotland Rugby and kind of how you ended up there?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm a physio. I kind of graduated 12, 13 years ago in Scotland. I then went to work for our National Health Service for 3 years and did my kind of junior rotations there, and then went into men's rugby full time. So I've worked with both. We've got 2 professional teams in Scotland. I've been pretty fortunate. I've worked with both. My kind of key focus is long-term injury and rehabilitation. That's where my skill set kind of lies. So yeah, I've worked with men's pro teams and 15s and toured with the 7s for a short period. And yeah, the last 3 years I've headed up the women's program, which is excellent. It's a massive area of development in rugby union, as you've seen from the population and growth stats there. And even in the 3 seasons that I've been involved, The number of fixtures has increased hugely. The competition demand has gone through the roof. We are now contracting athletes. We still predominantly amateur, as with the vast majority of rugby teams and international rugby teams. But it's definitely becoming more professional in our off-field approach. We've obviously full-time S&C, strength and conditioning, analysis, physio. We've got exceptional medical support, full-time coaches. So, and we have a player cohort of about 48 who are within our performance squad for our national programs. So it's a really exciting time to be involved in female rugby and female sport in general. And it's really exciting to see the growth in the game, and just generally the kind of media exposure which is going alongside that, which is excellent. We've obviously got our World Cup in New Zealand in 2022. It was unfortunately postponed from this year, which we're yet to qualify for. We're going through a qualification series at the moment in September. So we're very much gearing towards that, and with that in mind, and hopefully we go through that qualification process and we make it to the World Cup next year.
Oh, thank you for that. All right. Does anybody have any more questions? I see there was a question about if we'll send out a copy of the PowerPoint, and we will send out a recording of the entire webinar, and we can include the PowerPoint as well, if you're okay with that, Jamie.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. So we will send out the PowerPoint and the recording of this. I guess I'll ask another question. Do you have specific, I mean, obviously there's some physical differences, but challenges with working with female athletes, like, I'm trying to word my question, specific challenges regarding like mental, like do they handle that differently than the male athletes you've worked with? I'm curious how you, if you've seen anything like that where they kind of approach it differently or anything.
Post-injury or just kind of generally?
Generally, just injury, I guess post-injury, yeah, and prevention.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think from my approach, certainly, obviously being a male practitioner in a female environment, I have to massively tailor my approach compared to how I would have worked in rugby, when it's obviously a male-dominated environment. I think probably empathy is a skill that you have to use across both, obviously across platforms, but it's probably more necessary in women's rugby, and a greater understanding of the fact that players aren't professional. They're very much amateur. They've got so many other demands going on in life. Out with rugby, we are a very small proportion of their time demand, but we demand an exceptionally high amount for them, and we have to be really cognizant with that when we're programming. I mean, ultimately, our philosophy is very much person first, but also rugby first from a performance perspective. So we need to get the players on the field to perform and have the opportunity to develop skills, and it's kind of our job to manage that and make sure that we're putting those players in a safe environment if they're injured, and how we can tailor sessions to include them in that skill development. But I think that's probably the biggest thing we have to be aware of is external stressors in amateur sport. We train 3 nights a week quite often, most weekends. We have a lot of people who are full-time employed or they're full-time students, and a lot of them have very stressful jobs. We have dentists, physios, nurses, lawyers, people who work in the financial industry, are high-powered individuals with stressful work environments, and we demand a huge amount of their time. So being injured, then more of their time, I need to spend more time with them. So I have to be really aware of what I'm asking of these athletes. And it does mean you have to take a completely different approach sometimes to when you're working in a full-time environment. But certainly from a psychological input, we do use sports psych from time to time where it's warranted, but that would be athletes would be supported, male or female, with that. But yeah, definitely the biggest consideration is making sure that we're not overwhelming athletes and that we're not inhibiting their ability to perform by asking too much of them. And unfortunately, when you get to stages like we are at this now within the season, where it's critical that we perform and that we have to in the field and that we're targeting huge fixtures, time demand does become quite high for these players. So yeah, biggest thing.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you for everyone that attended. Like I said, we will send out the recording and include the PowerPoint in that as well. Next Wednesday for our webinar, we will be speaking with Dr. Naomi Datson. She's the senior lecturer in sports performance analysis at the University of Chichester. So I hope you guys will join us for that. Again, Jamie, thank you so much for your presentation and for your time. And
Thanks for having me.